requirements for creating, owning, and distributing software. And we're going to have a little bit of fun today with some programming using a slightly different programming approach. I'll talk to you a little bit about how that's going to work. So just to get right into it, we're going to take a look at our class expectations again, just to familiarize you with what my expectations are as the counselor for this merit badge. We're going to take a look at intellectual property. I'm going to talk about what the differences are between licensing and owning. Then I'm going to talk about the differences between freeware, open source, and commercial software. And finally, we're going to end off with some writing and debugging of code. Again, the expectations of this class are that you'll be working on the workbook for the Programming Merit Badge. You'll be filling that out and sharing it with me to demonstrate that you understand the material that we're covering here. If there's not sufficient room in the workbook, feel free to include additional notes in a written workbook or a Google Doc and scan that over and send it to me. And again, the code that we're writing, I'm not expecting you to transcribe. I'm just expecting you to demonstrate your understanding of the code as it applies to the questions in the workbook. I'm happy to look at your code if you want to share it, but it is definitely not a requirement. So today we're going to be talking about intellectual property. Intellectual property is things that you create and what the legal ownership is of those things. There's implicit ownership and there's explicit ownership, and these are things that you need to understand if you're going to be writing software. If you're writing software for a big organization, they have to be very protective of the software that they're writing, because if somebody else comes along and takes it, then or copies it and tries to pass it off as their own, there could be loss of revenue, people could lose their jobs, and there can be some really serious repercussions to that. So just like with all content that people create, books, machines, anything that people have the ability to build, there are legal precedents in place for those things to protect the creators. The first one is copyright protection. So anytime that you create something, you have an implicit copyright of that thing. So if you were to write a book, if you were to make a movie, and if you are to write a piece of software, you have a copyright protection over that. Sometimes you'll see on websites or movies or books, you'll see copyright 2020. That's basically saying that the copyright is valid as of 2020, stating that this is being actively maintained, and this gives you the legal right to press charges against anybody who tries to copy your content, your software, explicitly and pass it off as their own. Now, this does not mean that people cannot take what you've made and modify it slightly. If it's modified and it doesn't look exactly like the original, then there are legal precedents in place to protect those people who have created something unique. It may be similar to what you've done, but as long as it's unique in its own way, then it no longer violates that copyright. So there's some distinction there that you need to be aware of. Patents are similar to copyrights in that they protect those kind of creative works, but patents are much more specific. In order to have a patent, you have to have something that is shown to be clearly unique in some way. It performs some sort of a function that nothing else prior to it has ever done. And by applying for a patent for that, you can maintain that ownership of that, and it will protect you from anybody else coming along and developing something similar and trying to pass it off as their own. So if you came up with an algorithm, or you came up with a certain type of program that is able to identify images. So let's take a talk about something like Google's image search. Google was able to come up with a way of reverse image searching. So by taking an image, going back and finding other images that look similar to that. That is a piece of software that is valuable to them and is something that would justify having a patent for, because you would want to make sure that that particular algorithm that's being used, the software that was written to do that, isn't copied by other people, because that's something that's going to be profitable for them. Now, patents tend to be a lot more time consuming and require you to fill out paperwork and oftentimes hire a patent attorney, but they do have a strong legal precedence. Additionally, a lot of times you'll hear the term patent trolls. Oftentimes companies or people will go and look for pieces of software that don't already have patents on them, then apply for patents and use those to try to profit off of the companies that originally defined those. And that is a very unscrupulous way of making money and trying to profit off of other people's intellectual property. But it is something to be aware of, and a good reason for you to consider if you are writing software and you come up with something unique, to patent that before somebody has a chance to try to profit off of your intellectual property. Trademarks are more for titles, company names, and logos. So if you have a software company that you are starting up, or you write a piece of software and you make a logo or come up with a clever name for it, oftentimes you'll want to get that trademarked. This way other people can't take that name from you and try to pass their product off as yours. So getting a trademark on that is a good way to protect your company's reputation or your software's reputation, so that other people don't claim to be your company or claim to manage your software without your explicit permission. Again, these are things that need to be filed for and would cost some money, although they are not as complicated as patents, which patents oftentimes you have to have diagrams explaining how things work and very comprehensive documentation on how your software works. For trademarks, you really just need to pass along the name or the logo, but you do have to be careful, because you need to make sure that such a trademark doesn't already exist, otherwise you'll be violating somebody else's trademark. And then the last type of intellectual property is trade secrets. Trade secrets basically indicate that you are working for a company that has some information that is proprietary to that company. This means that it's information that's key to their business processes or the software that they maintain, and they will oftentimes want to keep that type of information secret, keep it from getting into other companies' hands, because then they can use that to make some profit off of purchasing stocks, or just basically trying to beat them to the punch. So if you have, let's say, work for a big software company, and you have been working on a new search algorithm, and this search algorithm is 50% more effective than Google's search algorithm, and you've tested it, and internally it's proven to work really well, but you're afraid that if another company were to find out about this, they may be able to put it to market faster and actually get some sort of credit for this before you have a chance to file a patent or before you have a chance to get it to market yourself. So that would be considered a trade secret in that it's something that your company owns and or you personally own, and you don't want getting out into the market before you've had a chance to be able to publicize it yourself. So these are all ways of protecting your intellectual property. Your intellectual property, in this case, being your software. Intellectual property can also be thought of as the actual software that you buy. So back in the day, you used to go and you'd buy software on floppy disks or on CDs. These days, for the most part, when you're buying software, you're downloading it off the internet. And when you're buying software, unlike when you go to the store and you buy a bike or you buy a car or you buy groceries, when you buy those things, you own them. When you buy software, however, you're actually licensing it. So what you're doing is, since digital media is not a physical item, it is software that you're running on your computer. When you're purchasing software, you're licensing it from the company. That means that they are allowing you to use their software under the terms and conditions that they provide. So many times you've signed up for different services online, you'll see that they'll give you a whole list of terms and conditions and they'll ask you to agree to before you start using their service. These are the terms and conditions that state whether you own the data that is being created within this application, or they own it, whether or not you can redistribute this software yourself. For instance, a lot of software companies are not going to want you to resell your software. They're not going to want you to, if you license a Microsoft product. In general, you're licensing that for yourself, or maybe for yourself and for your family, but you don't have the rights to then sell that to somebody else, and that's stuff that's listed in their terms and conditions and stuff that you need to be aware of. There's a few different ways that companies can license software. They can license it as freeware. Freeware meaning that it is free to use. Generally, these are still given some sort of limitations. So for instance, if it's a free piece of software, you can download it and use it for personal use, but sometimes they don't want you to use it for commercial use. Oftentimes they'll want you to pay something if you're using it as part of commercial use, but if you're just going to use it on your personal computer, then you can use it at no cost to yourself. Freeware might also state that you can't resell that software. You can't sell it to another person without by trying to make a profit off of something that somebody else has created. Shareware is a little different in that shareware you can download and you can use for sometimes a length of time or sometimes indefinitely, but with some sort of pop-ups or ads. And what shareware does is it allows you to use a product with the expectation that after a certain amount of time you are going to pay for it because you're getting some sort of value out of the software, and you want to you want to make sure that the company is making a profit off of this. Sometimes you'll see shareware titles will come up with a little pop-up asking you to make a contribution, or sometimes it'll just stop working after a certain period of time and tell you if you want to continue to use this, you need to purchase the product. Demos work very similarly. Usually what demos do is they will give you access to a portion of the program. So maybe they'll let you use a few features out of that program, but they won't let you use the whole program. And you can use it as long as you want, as long as you're only going to use those few features. But if you decided at some point in the future that you wanted to use all of the features in that, you would then need to purchase that product. And then the fourth one is open source. Open source is basically code that's written and when you get into programming, open source is very important because a lot of programming languages rely on open source software to be able to uh, build new products, build new software systems. Open source is basically code that people write that they then make the source code available through services like GitHub and CodeHub and other things like that, Bitbucket, that will allow you to download that source code and then either use it or make modifications to it to use it in a way that personally benefits you, or to actually contribute to it so you can make changes and then contribute your changes back to the open source software so that other people can benefit from the updates that you made as well. A lot of times if you're going to get into programming, open source is a good way to get into the field of programming because you can start contributing to a larger project and get a better understanding of how larger projects are structured and familiarize yourself with how programming works in the real world. The one thing that I don't mention here is commercial software. Commercial software is basically software that you are purchasing a license for, and you will be able to use it as with all of its features as long as you're using it within the terms and agreements stated in the licenses. So that should cover everything that you need to know for requirement 4 on intellectual property. Before we break today, I'd like to just kind of share a neat little website that you can use for learning how to program. It's Scratch. The URL is scratch.mit.edu. And basically what Scratch is a sometimes people call these blocks. It's a way of programming with just blocks of code that allow you to do things that would normally require you to write a program similar to what we were doing in some of the other sections. So what I'd really do is I'd highly encourage you to play around with this, maybe take some time to write a small program. We go and we create a new Scratch program here. What we can do is just create something without any, well, by default it's going to give you this cat here, and we can use this cat to move 10 steps. And if we hit this green flag, actually, hold on, what I need to do is add in an event. We say when green flag is checked, 10 steps, and that'll do that. So this gives you a bunch of different things that you can use to handle motion. We can have this change the look with a variety of different capabilities here. So there gives you the ability to add in word bubbles. There's the ability to add in sound files. Events, which allow us to process input. So we talked a little bit about input. Clicking on this flag that we added here is one form of input. We can also use things like the spacebar or the keyboard in general, so that I can press the keyboard and it'll follow these steps that we have defined here. We can broadcast messages and receive messages. And then we have our control blocks. We talked about control blocks in our last lesson. These allow us to do things like looping through or setting conditional statements. And then these conditional statements will use our operators to be able to check for the value of something. So if we wanted to look to see if something was greater than or less than, you could put that into a conditional statement here, and then we can process a certain set of actions based on the values that whether or not those conditions are met. So this is just a really good way for you to get accustomed to programming and writing a program for yourself without having to get into understanding the syntax of the programs. So just for today, spend a little time working on Scratch, maybe put a game together. I have some games here on my profile that I've created as examples, and you could create things like here I created a little race car game, which is fairly simple, but it allows you to just kind of drive a car along a road and stay away from other cars. And you can see the car crashes into another car, it turns into a bear. Not sure why that happened. I think when I was working on this with one of my other scout groups, they thought it would be funny for the car to turn into a bear. So that gives you a good example of some of the things that you can do with Scratch if you take the time to set up a program. And that would do it for today. So go ahead and build something of your own, and the next time we'll kind of continue on with some of the last requirement, and we'll go through some more coding examples and hopefully give you all the information you need to wrap up and achieve your merit badge. All right, thanks everybody, and have a good evening.